The air hung thin and cold that September morning in 2005 when Rebecca Hayes kissed her 7-year-old daughter Emma goodbye at the trailhead. The autumn sun had just begun to paint the granite cliffs of Yosemite National Park in shades of gold and amber, and Rebecca's hiking boots crunched against the dry pine needles as she adjusted her day pack. Her husband David stood beside their silver Ford Explorer, one hand raised in a wave, the other resting on Emma's small shoulder. "I'll be back by 4, Rebecca called out, her voice echoing slightly against the valley walls. 5 at the latest. Those would be the last words her family would ever hear her speak. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. Rebecca Hayes was 34 years old, an elementary school teacher from Fresno with a passion for the Sierra Nevada wilderness. She had hiked the Mist Trail dozens of times, knew every switchback and vista point by heart. The trail was well marked, moderately difficult, and on a clear Saturday in early fall, it would be populated with hundreds of other hikers. Park rangers estimated that between 300 and 400 people used that trail the day Rebecca disappeared. But she never arrived at the top. She never made it back to the parking lot. By 6 that evening, as shadows grew long and purple across the valley floor, David Hayes reported his wife missing. The search began within hours. Park rangers, search and rescue teams, and volunteer groups combed the area around the Mist Trail for 3 solid weeks. They used tracking dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging equipment, and enlisted the help of experienced climbers to examine the more treacherous cliff faces. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, reviewed trail camera footage, and checked every possible route Rebecca might have taken. Nothing. Not a single trace, no torn fabric caught on branches, no dropped water bottle, no sign of a fall or struggle. Rebecca Hayes had simply vanished into the granite wilderness as if she had never existed at all. The investigation consumed the Hayes family. David took a leave of absence from his job as an engineer, spending every available moment coordinating with park officials and organizing private search parties. Emma, too young to fully comprehend the permanence of her mother's absence, drew pictures of the 3 of them together and left them on Rebecca's pillow each night. Detective Linda Martinez from the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office took over the case when it became clear that this was more than a simple hiking accident. She was a 20-year veteran with sharp eyes and an intuition honed by countless missing persons cases in the Sierra foothills. Something about Rebecca's disappearance didn't sit right with her. Most people who get lost in the wilderness leave some kind of trail, Martinez told David during one of their many meetings at the Hayes home in Fresno. They drop things, they leave footprints in soft soil, they disturb vegetation. Your wife seems to have left nothing at all. Martinez dug deeper. She discovered that Rebecca had been acting differently in the weeks before her disappearance. According to colleagues at Riverside Elementary School where she taught, Rebecca had seemed distracted, anxious. She had made several phone calls during her lunch breaks, always stepping outside where no one could overhear. She'd taken 2 personal days in August, unusual for someone who rarely missed work. David confirmed that Rebecca had seemed troubled, but insisted she wouldn't tell him what was bothering her. "She said it was nothing I needed to worry about," he explained, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "She said she just needed to work something out on her own." Bank records showed a withdrawal of $8,000 in cash 3 weeks before Rebecca's disappearance. When Martinez asked David about it, he looked genuinely shocked. He knew nothing about any large withdrawal. The detective's investigation led her to an unexpected discovery. Rebecca had been exchanging emails with someone named James Collier. The emails, recovered from her school computer, were carefully worded, but suggested a connection that went back many years. They mentioned promises that should have been kept, and truths that needed to come to light. James Collier turned out to be a 42-year-old architect living in Sacramento. When Martinez questioned him, he was cooperative but visibly shaken. He explained that he and Rebecca had known each other in high school, had dated briefly before Rebecca met David. They had reconnected at a class reunion 6 months earlier. "We were just friends," Collier insisted, sitting in the interrogation room with his hands clasped tightly on the metal table. "We talked about old times, about how our lives had turned out. That's all." But Martinez pressed harder, and eventually Collier's story began to shift. "Okay, look," he said, running his hands through his thinning hair. "Rebecca wanted to talk about something that happened senior year, something involving her brother, Kyle. Kyle Patterson had been Rebecca's older brother, a promising college student who had died in a car accident in 1989 when Rebecca was 18. According to Collier, Rebecca had recently learned information suggesting that Kyle's death might not have been an accident. "She said someone told her the truth," Collier explained. "She wouldn't say who, but she was determined to find proof. She thought she knew where to look." The revelation sent Martinez's investigation in an entirely new direction. She tracked down Kyle Patterson's accident report and discovered that he had crashed his vehicle on Highway 41, just outside the southern entrance to Yosemite National Park. He had been traveling alone, late at night, and investigators at the time concluded he had fallen asleep at the wheel. But Rebecca's parents, Arthur and Grace Patterson, had always harbored doubts. "Kyle wasn't tired that night," Grace told Martinez when the detective visited their modest home in Oakhurst. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she poured tea. "He had called us around 9. He was wide awake, excited. He said he had something important to tell us, but he wanted to do it in person." Arthur Patterson, now in his late 70s, sat quietly in his recliner, his face carved with the lines of long-held grief. The police said the brake lines were old, that they failed. But Kyle had just had the car serviced 2 weeks before. Everything was supposed to be fine. Martinez obtained the original accident file and discovered something that had been noted but never fully investigated. The night Kyle died, he had checked into a small motel near Wawona, inside the park boundaries. The motel clerk remembered him asking about hiking trails, and specifically about areas that were difficult to access. Emma Hayes was 14 years old when Detective Martinez came to their house in 2012, 7 years after her mother's disappearance. The detective, now graying at the temples but no less determined, had never closed Rebecca's case. "Your mother was looking for something," Martinez told Emma and David, spreading photocopied documents across their dining room table. "I believe she found a connection between your Uncle Kyle's death and something hidden in the park." David stared at the papers, his face pale. "You think someone killed Kyle, and then killed Rebecca when she started asking questions?" "I think," Martinez said carefully, "that your wife discovered something dangerous, something worth keeping secret." Over the next few years, the case grew cold despite Martinez's efforts. She retired in 2018, and the Hayes file was transferred to a younger detective who had dozens of other cases demanding attention. David eventually sold their house in Fresno and moved with Emma to Portland, trying to build a new life away from the memories. Emma studied criminal justice at Portland State University, her mother's disappearance shaping the entire trajectory of her life. She learned about forensic techniques, search and rescue protocols, and the psychology of missing persons cases. She became obsessed with understanding what had happened on that September morning in 2005. In the summer of 2024, Emma returned to Yosemite for the first time in nearly 2 decades. She was 26 years old, with her mother's determined eyes and her father's analytical mind. She had saved money from her job at a private investigation firm and purchased a professional-grade drone with high-resolution cameras and thermal imaging capabilities. "I know the Rangers searched everywhere," she told her father over the phone the night before she left for California. "But they didn't have the technology we have now. Drones can access places that would take teams of climbers days to reach." David wanted to come with her, but his health had deteriorated over the years. The stress and grief had taken their toll. "Be careful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't lose you too." Emma spent 2 weeks flying her drone over the areas surrounding the mist trail, carefully documenting every cliff face, every hidden ravine, every section of wilderness that seemed inaccessible from the ground. She focused on the areas where her Uncle Kyle had been asking about all those years ago, cross-referencing old trail maps with current satellite imagery. On the 13th day, flying over a remote section of granite cliffs about 2 miles east of the mist trail, the drone's camera captured something unusual. Wedged into a narrow crevice, barely visible even from the air, was what appeared to be the remnants of a weathered backpack. Emma's hands shook as she guided the drone closer. The crevice was in an area that would be invisible from any established trail, accessible only by technical climbing equipment. The park's original search parties would have had no reason to look there. She contacted the current lead investigator on her mother's case, Detective Raymond Foster, and within 48 hours, a specialized climbing team had been assembled. Emma stood at the base of the cliff, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat as 2 climbers rappelled down to the crevice. The backpack was there, along with what appeared to be camping equipment. But there was more. As the climbers carefully documented the scene, they discovered human remains, partially preserved by the dry, cool conditions of the narrow space. DNA testing would later confirm what Emma already knew in her heart. They had found Rebecca Hayes. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. The location was extremely remote. The climbing equipment found with Rebecca was professional grade, not something a day hiker would carry. And most puzzling of all, clutched in the skeletal remains of her hand was a small waterproof case. Inside the case was a USB drive. The data on the drive took weeks to recover. The drive had survived the elements remarkably well, and forensic specialists were able to retrieve most of its contents. What they found was shocking. Photographs, documents, and detailed notes about a series of illegal logging operations that had been occurring in restricted areas of Yosemite National Park in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Rebecca's notes explained everything. Her brother Kyle had been working as a seasonal park ranger while in college. He had accidentally discovered evidence of an organized operation harvesting old-growth timber from protected areas, including several rare giant sequoias. The operation was sophisticated, using remote areas and carefully timed operations to avoid detection. Kyle had documented everything, but before he could turn his evidence over to federal authorities, his car had been sabotaged. The brake line failure was no accident. Rebecca had learned about Kyle's investigation from an unexpected source. Daniel Porter, one of the men who had been involved in the illegal logging operation. Porter, dying of cancer in 2005, had contacted Rebecca shortly before her final hike. Guilt-ridden and wanting to make amends before his death, he told her everything, including where Kyle had hidden his primary evidence cache. The evidence was hidden in that remote crevice, the same place where Kyle had first discovered the logging operation. Rebecca had hired a climbing guide to take her there, determined to recover her brother's documentation and finally bring his killers to justice. But she hadn't realized she was being watched. The forensic evidence told a grim story. Rebecca had reached the crevice and recovered Kyle's original evidence, but as she was preparing to descend, someone had cut her rope. The fall hadn't killed her immediately, but trapped in the narrow space with severe injuries and no way to call for help. She had succumbed to exposure over the following days. The climbing guide who had taken her there, Marcus Webb, had worked for the same logging company all those years ago. When Porter confessed to Rebecca, he had also warned the others. Webb had volunteered to guide Rebecca, knowing exactly what he planned to do. Detective Foster arrested Webb at his home in Merced. The man was now 63 years old, retired, and thought he had gotten away with it. But the USB drive Rebecca died protecting contained not just evidence of the original crimes, but her own meticulous notes documenting everything Porter had told her, including Webb's involvement in Kyle's murder. The case made national headlines in the fall of 2024. The logging operation had involved several prominent California businessmen, though most of them were now dead or elderly. Those still living faced federal charges for environmental crimes, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Webb was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Emma Hayes attended every day of the trial. She sat in the courtroom, her father beside her, as prosecutors laid out the complete story of greed, murder, and the extraordinary courage of a schoolteacher who had died trying to find justice for her brother. "Your mother was a hero," the prosecutor told the jury during closing arguments. "She knew the danger she was facing." Daniel Porter warned her that these men were ruthless, that they had killed before, but she went anyway because she believed that truth mattered more than safety, that justice was worth any risk. Webb was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. In December 2024, Rebecca and Kyle Patterson were buried side by side in a small cemetery in Oakhurst, overlooking the Sierra Nevada mountains they had both loved. Hundreds of people attended the funeral, including former students of Rebecca's, park rangers, and investigators who had worked on the case over the years. Linda Martinez, the original detective who had never given up on finding answers, gave a eulogy. "Rebecca Hayes disappeared 20 years ago," she said, her voice carrying across the gathering. "But she was never truly gone. She lived on in her daughter's determination, in the questions that wouldn't stay buried, and in the evidence she made sure would survive even when she could not." Emma scattered wildflower seeds on both graves. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said softly, "but you can rest now, both of you. The truth came to light, just like you wanted. And I promise I'll keep hiking those trails, keep looking at those mountains, and remember that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." David Hayes stood beside his daughter, his arm around her shoulders, finally able to begin the grieving process that had been suspended for 2 decades. The mystery that had haunted their family had been solved. Not through miracles or coincidences, but through determination, modern technology, and a daughter's unwavering love. The giant sequoias that Kyle had died protecting still stand in Yosemite National Park, their ancient bark scarred but resilient, reaching toward the sky that Rebecca had loved to explore. Rangers now tell visitors about the 2 people who gave their lives to protect these trees, a brother and sister whose courage ensured that these natural wonders would survive for generations to come. And on clear autumn mornings, when the sun paints the granite cliffs gold and amber, just like it did that September day in 2005, hikers sometimes pause on the mist trail and think about the teacher who never came home, the mystery that endured for 20 years, and the daughter whose determination finally brought the truth to light. The years following Marcus Webb's conviction brought unexpected revelations that deepened the story even further. In early 2025, Emma Hayes received a letter forwarded through Detective Foster's office. The return address showed a federal correctional facility in Arizona, and the sender was a name she didn't recognize: Thomas Brennan. Brennan had been a park maintenance worker in Yosemite during the late 1980s. Now 71 years old and serving time for unrelated fraud charges, he had read about the trial and felt compelled to share what he knew. His letter was carefully written, the handwriting shaky but legible. "I saw your uncle the night he died," Brennan wrote. "I've carried that weight for 36 years, and I can't take it to my grave without telling someone who deserves to know the truth." Emma flew to Arizona with her father the following week. David had been reluctant at first, worried that reopening old wounds would only bring more pain, but Emma convinced him that they needed to hear whatever Brennan had to say. They sat across from him in a sterile visiting room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as the old man told them a story that had haunted him for decades. Thomas Brennan had been working a late shift on September 14, 1989, repairing damaged fencing along Highway 41. Around 10:30 that night, he saw Kyle Patterson's car pulled over at a scenic overlook about 5 miles from where the accident would later occur. Kyle was standing beside his vehicle, talking to 2 men. One of them was Marcus Webb. The other was a man Brennan identified from trial photographs as Richard Caldwell, one of the businessmen behind the logging operation who had died in 2019. They were arguing, Brennan recalled, his weathered face etched with regret. "Your uncle had something in his hands, looked like photographs or documents. He was showing them to the other men, and I could hear him saying something about federal investigators." Webb grabbed his arm and your uncle pulled away, got back in his car. Brennan had driven past, thinking it was just a heated discussion between acquaintances. 20 minutes later, driving back the same route, he saw emergency vehicles surrounding Kyle's crashed car. He had put the pieces together over the following days, but convinced himself it could have been coincidence. He was young, had a family to support, and the logging company employed half the men in his small town. "I told myself I didn't really see anything," Brennan said, his eyes glistening. "I told myself it wasn't my business, but I knew. I always knew." David Hayes sat motionless, his jaw clenched tight. Emma reached across the table, though she couldn't quite touch Brennan's hand with the barrier between them. "Why tell us now?" she asked. "Because your mother died trying to do what I was too scared to do," Brennan said simply, "and because I'm running out of time to make things right." Brennan's testimony, though coming decades late, provided crucial corroboration for the prosecution's case and helped fill in the final gaps in the timeline. It confirmed that Kyle had confronted the men responsible, that he had evidence in his possession that night, and that his death had been a deliberate act of murder, not a panicked improvisation. Detective Foster used Brennan's statement to reopen several related cases, including the suspicious death of another park ranger in 1991, who had also been asking questions about illegal activity in remote sections of the park. The investigation expanded, reaching into archives and cold case files that had been gathering dust for decades. Emma returned to Yosemite that spring, this time not to search, but to understand. She hiked every trail her mother had loved, stood at the overlook where her uncle had confronted his killers, and made the difficult climb to the crevice where her mother had spent her final days. The Park Service had installed a small plaque there, accessible only to technical climbers, commemorating Rebecca Hayes and Kyle Patterson. "In memory of those who gave everything to protect these ancient forests," the plaque read, "may their courage inspire all who follow." Standing at that remote spot, hundreds of feet above the valley floor, with the wind whipping through the granite corridors, Emma finally allowed herself to fully grieve. For 20 years, she had focused on finding answers, on solving the mystery, on bringing justice. Now, with all the pieces finally in place, she could mourn the mother she had lost, and the uncle she had never known. She pulled out her phone and called her father. "I'm at the place where Mom was," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Dad, it's beautiful here. I understand why she came. I understand why Uncle Kyle loved this park so much." David's voice cracked as he responded, "Tell me about it. Help me see it." Emma described the sweeping vista, the way the afternoon sun illuminated the granite faces, the tenacious wildflowers growing in impossible cracks in the rock, the distant sound of waterfalls echoing through the canyon. She talked until the sun began to set, sharing the view with her father, connecting him to the place that had taken so much from their family, but had also revealed the depth of Rebecca's love and determination. The following months brought a different kind of closure. Emma was approached by a documentary filmmaker interested in telling the complete story of the Hayes-Patterson case. Initially hesitant, she eventually agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to honor her mother's memory and raise awareness about environmental crimes. The documentary, titled The Truth in the Trees, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2026 and received widespread critical acclaim. It wove together the stories of Kyle and Rebecca, the decades-long cover-up, and Emma's determined search for answers. The film included interviews with Linda Martinez, Daniel Porter's widow, other park rangers who had suspected something was wrong but lacked evidence, and environmental advocates who explained the ongoing threats to protected wilderness areas. During the film's production, Emma discovered something that brought her unexpected comfort. In reviewing her mother's belongings, which had been stored in boxes since 2005, she found a journal Rebecca had kept sporadically over the years. The final entry was dated 2 days before her disappearance. "Emma asked me today why I seemed sad," Rebecca had written. "I told her I wasn't sad, just thinking about important things. The truth is, I'm terrified about what I'm planning to do. But I keep thinking about Kyle, about how he died trying to do the right thing. I think about the kind of world I want Emma to grow up in, the kind of person I want her to become. If I don't do this, if I let fear stop me, what am I teaching her? That truth doesn't matter, that we should look away from injustice because it's safer. I can't live with that. Whatever happens, I need her to know that some things are worth the risk. Some fights are worth fighting, even when the odds seem impossible." Emma read those words at her mother's memorial service, held on the 20th anniversary of her disappearance. Hundreds of people gathered in Yosemite Valley, including current and former park rangers, environmental activists, Rebecca's former students who were now adults with children of their own, and members of law enforcement who had worked the case over the years. "My mother knew the danger," Emma told the assembled crowd, her voice amplified by the portable sound system. "She went anyway, not because she was reckless, but because she understood something fundamental about courage. It's not the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act despite fear, to stand up for what's right, even when it costs everything." The memorial included the planting of a grove of young sequoia trees in an area that had been damaged by the illegal logging decades earlier. Each tree was dedicated to someone who had fought to protect the park: Kyle Patterson, Rebecca Hayes, and the other ranger whose death was now being reinvestigated as a possible homicide. David Hayes, now using a cane but standing tall beside his daughter, placed his hand on the smooth bark of Rebecca's tree. "She always loved these giants," he said softly. She used to tell Emma that they survived because they were strong enough to bend in the wind, to adapt to fire and drought and storms. I think she was trying to teach us something about resilience. The documentary's success led to renewed scrutiny of environmental crimes in national parks across the country. Several cold cases were reopened, new investigative protocols were established, and funding was allocated for better monitoring of remote wilderness areas. Rebecca's death, tragic as it was, had catalyzed changes that would protect the places she loved for generations to come. In the summer of 2026, Emma accepted a position with the National Park Service's Investigative Division. Her job was to look into suspicious activities in protected areas, using both traditional investigative techniques and modern technology like the drone that had helped her find her mother. On her first day of work, she received a package from Linda Martinez, the retired detective who had never given up on Rebecca's case. Inside was a framed photograph showing Rebecca on a hiking trail, laughing at something off-camera, her face lit with joy and vitality. A note was attached in Martinez's careful handwriting. "Your mother would be proud of who you've become. She set out to uncover one truth, and in doing so, she started a movement. Keep asking questions, keep searching, keep fighting. That's how we honor those who came before us." Emma placed the photograph on her desk, where she could see it every day. Sometimes, during difficult investigations or moments of doubt, she would look at her mother's smile and remember why this work mattered. The ripple effects of the case continued to spread. Marcus Webb, facing life in prison, eventually provided detailed testimony about the full extent of the illegal logging operation, implicating several individuals who had managed to avoid prosecution during the initial investigation. His cooperation led to civil suits that resulted in millions of dollars being paid to environmental restoration funds. Daniel Porter's confession, which had started everything, was published posthumously by his widow. She established a foundation in his name dedicated to supporting whistleblowers who expose environmental crimes, turning his guilt and redemption into something constructive. Thomas Brennan, the maintenance worker who had finally told the truth after 36 years, was granted early release from prison in recognition of his cooperation. He spent his remaining years volunteering at environmental education centers, telling young people about the importance of speaking up when they witness wrongdoing. Emma visited him several times before he died in 2027. During their last conversation, Brennan told her something that stayed with her. "Your mother had a choice," he said, his voice weak but clear. "She could have lived with the secret, taken Porter's information to her grave like he almost did. Most people would have. But she chose differently. That's the thing about courage. It's always a choice, and every choice we make shapes the world we leave behind." David Hayes lived to see justice fully served and his wife properly laid to rest. He died peacefully in 2028, with Emma beside him holding his hand. His final words were about Rebecca. "Tell her I never stopped looking," he whispered. "Tell her I never gave up hope." "She knows, Dad," Emma said through her tears. She always knew. Years passed, and the story of Rebecca Hayes and Kyle Patterson became part of Yosemite's history, taught to new rangers during their training, included in visitor center exhibits about conservation heroes, referenced in environmental law classes across the country. The giant sequoias they died protecting continued to grow, adding rings to their ancient trunks, reaching higher toward the sky. Emma continued her work with the Park Service, solving cases, protecting wilderness areas, and training a new generation of investigators. She married a fellow ranger in 2029, and in 2031 she gave birth to a daughter. She named her Rebecca. On little Rebecca's 7th birthday, Emma took her to Yosemite for the first time. They hiked an easy trail together, Emma pointing out the different trees and wildlife, teaching her daughter to appreciate the wilderness her grandmother and great-uncle had loved. They visited the memorial grove, and Emma told her daughter the story, carefully and honestly, about the brave people for whom the trees had been planted. "Did she ever get scared?" young Rebecca asked, looking up at the towering sequoia that bore her grandmother's name. "I'm sure she did," Emma replied. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared." The little girl thought about this, then reached out to touch the bark of the massive tree. "I want to be brave like her." Emma knelt beside her daughter, both of them placing their hands on the ancient bark. "You already are, sweetheart. Every time you tell the truth, every time you stand up for what's right, every time you choose courage over comfort, you're being like her." The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Somewhere in the distance, a jay called out. its cry echoing through the trees. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying the scent of pine and earth and possibility. Emma looked up at the tree that would outlive them all, this living monument to her mother's courage and sacrifice. In that moment, standing with her daughter in the forest her mother had died to protect, Emma finally felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. Peace. The mystery had been solved. Justice had been served. The truth had come to light, exactly as Rebecca Hayes had intended, and most importantly, her legacy lived on, not just in memorial plaques and documentary films, but in the choices being made every day by people inspired by her story. The giant sequoias stood as silent witnesses to it all, their roots deep in the earth, their branches reaching toward the sky, surviving as they had for thousands of years through fire and drought and human greed. They would be there long after everyone involved in this story had passed, a testament to the enduring power of nature and the equally powerful force of human courage in its defense. As Emma and her daughter walked back down the trail, hand in hand, the sun began to set over the granite peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Another day was ending in Yosemite National Park, but the story that had begun with a disappearance 21 years earlier would continue to resonate, inspiring others to choose truth over silence, courage over fear, and justice over convenience. Rebecca Hayes had disappeared in these mountains, but she had never truly been lost. She lived on in every person who heard her story and decided to be a little braver, a little more truthful, a little more willing to fight for what was right. She lived on in the daughter who had refused to stop searching and in the granddaughter who would carry her name into the future. And she lived on in these ancient trees, standing tall and strong, protected by the sacrifice she had made, growing ever skyward toward the light.